Good afternoon and welcome to the Virtually Speaking Podcast, episode number 204. My name is Pete Fletcher, a.k.a. Pedro Arrow, and joining me once again is Mr. John Nicholson. John, how you doing, man?
Good. I'm sitting here counting my money here. I'm going to have to buy a new CPU, I found out.
Really? Oh, yeah? What's the matter with your old one? Is it just getting too old? What's the problem with it?
Well, so, I mean, this is the thing. You start like one project, you're like, oh, I should probably upgrade my desktop from Windows 10 to Windows 11. And I'm like, I've got a pretty fast computer, met a guy in a back alley and got a good GPU and some things. And I go to do the upgrade, and it's like, oh, yeah, your CPU's not supported. And I'm like, great. So I got to go upgrade the CPU. And if I'm going to upgrade the CPU, I might as well get a new motherboard. And then it's like, I'm going to buy a new PC. So it's, one thing leads to another. But this is always the problem of life cycle issues is you have one thing you need to fix, and it's just like pulling that thread and the entire tapestry comes, off the wall at you.
Yeah, and that's why today's topic, man, I saw on Twitter just this past week that, we were moving into end of life, as they say, for Windows Server 2016. And I was like, wow, is it already end of life? And, that brings questions like, is it really end of life? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what that means and also how that looks in a SaaS model as well. And so joining us to have that discussion is our good friend, Mr. Glenn Sizemore. Glenn, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Pete, how you doing, man? Good to be back.
Yeah,
John,
man,
I can commensurate. I'm going through similar pains right now. Netflix wasn't quite streaming quite well, so I've had to upgrade my home network to 10 gig and discover all the joys that is Cat 8 and the Terminators that come with it. So yeah, it's a slippery slope indeed. It starts off with I'll just spend a little money, and next thing you know, you've spent way too much money, and your wife's in the kitchen looking at you going, "What happened?"
There's
exactly.
40 gig optics on the floor, and there's tears about the wallet. So I like it.
So yeah, like I said, Server 2016. It says it's end of life, but we all know that it's not like you can't stop using it. I mean, you're still going to get support. So why don't we just start with? And I know this isn't a Microsoft podcast, but we can use it as an example and then maybe transition. But why don't we start, Glenn? Maybe you could just set the playing field here. Like, what is the difference between when someone says something is end of life, but then there's still some sort of extended support?
Yeah, typically what different companies call these things different things, but typically end of life basically is end of sale. You're no longer able to buy it, but that doesn't mean that we're no longer or the vendor is no longer supporting existing customers. Support will typically run for a significantly longer period of time, depending on when the last customer bought the product and what the support agreement was, and you have your end of support timelines, and then that's just like immediate support. There's always some form of long-term support where you can come back in and re-up support yet again, but as the product gets older and older, the cost of those support agreements tends to go up, and you get to a point after somewhere between like 4 and 6 years after something goes end of sale, where it is typically cheaper just to do the life cycle and move to the newer version of the product. Of course, that's if you're like buying perpetual licensing and owning hardware. As you said, none of this applies to a SaaS model at all.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to get into that in a minute, but I wanted to just chew a little bit on this existing one for one. It's like, there's definitely support still after the first 5 years for most. I say 5 years because that's like the Microsoft model, but there's always like some level of support. I think one of the examples we were talking about earlier was, you're going to get support. There's going to be no new features. But of course, when things like Log4j come along, they're going to make sure that it's secure, at least for another extended period of time, say 5 or so years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But even then, like It's
Microsoft
a really
has had that. Yeah, they've had that extended support date for the security patch, and then like XP's a year out, and then a CVE 10 drops. They're like, fine, here's another patch. You silly morons who've been running this OS for 15 years. Like this reminds me of this kind of like Walking Dead analogy of you've got like end of sale, which is like it's dying. Then you've got like end of official support, which is we don't ship any new features, and we might not even fix things that have broken because of compatibility issues. So like I ran into this with Exchange 2010, OA broke basically because the plugin framework that it was based on in 2010 was deprecated by the entire industry, or like
Oh,
Flash
man.
gets deprecated. But yeah, the net, it was called the Netscape plugin, even though no one used Netscape. Like it just OA stopped working, and you had to, it's like, and Microsoft sitting in the corner going, yeah, we ship security patches, but we're not completely refactoring this. Go upgrade to Exchange 2016, you Muppets. And then you get to like, okay, Microsoft is doing you a favor, and then gets to the, Glenn, how much money do you have? Option.
Yeah, no, like nothing is ever truly end of support. If you back up a big enough dump truck, any vendor will start like spinning up your custom support shop to build your patches. But it gets very expensive very quickly. And honestly, this is one of the things that is really driving the SaaSification of the industry. Exchange is a great example where you have a core business service that you were on annual upgrade cycles, and there was constantly new features coming in, and keeping this stuff fully patched and upgraded and fully compliant, it was a full-time job. Like every company had an Exchange team. It wasn't an Exchange guy, it was a team. There was multiples, right? It was a big thing. And that big thing was complicated, and if it went down, it was a big deal, right? Like it was the backbone of business. It replaced telephones in a lot of ways.
Oh, dude, I used to work for Accenture, and we used to do large enterprise migrations of Exchange because the in-house talent is not going to be prepared to do these intensive migrations. So yeah, it is a full-time gig, and then on top of that, there's usually a consulting service that needs to come in to do the really heavy lifting.
Yeah, and if we fast forward to 2021, what's happened? Well, everyone just pays Microsoft for Office 365, and they get their Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive through the vendor who writes that software, and they don't think about it; it just works.
Well, and then even when it doesn't, if there's an outage on 365, who the hell was I going to email anyways? They're also down too. Like, it's like it's like if the phone network crashes but your cell phone still works. Like, cool. Who am I going to call? Like,
yeah, nothing like a good old US East 1 outage to show you that the entire world sits in one data center.
Yeah, no, but it's you mentioned that dump truck full of money. I remember. Normally these are kind of shadowy things that are like, hey, you better have an ELA and $250,000 minimum discussion. But Microsoft did discuss publicly extended support for XP, and the first year was $100 per desktop. Okay, maybe there's someone might be willing to pay that. The second year was like $300, and then the third year they didn't even want to publish, but I think it was like $800 or $1,000 or something.
Oh my goodness!
Like it was.
And yet, I still see XP. I still see XP if I'm in. Sometimes I'm in an airport and I see XP, but like you still see that green start button. It's like, who's still using XP?
There's a lot of XP in the cloud, my friends. Like I'm not going to tell you, but it's more than zero. There are quite a few XP and Windows 2000 workload. Like this is the good and bad that came along with server virtualization and industry modernization. As the graybeards will remember, we used to delete things. Like there would be a life cycle. A server would come to the end, and you'd move the data and you'd turn it off and you'd throw it away. That doesn't happen anymore, right? It just things perpetually move from platform to platform to platform, and now we're at the point where we're replatforming them into cloud SaaS services so that they never have to move again. And it's great in a lot of ways, because what it means is solved problems don't have to be readdressed. It's solved. So you just yes, this particular expense workflow was written in a way such that it only works on a Windows XP desktop, but it is just cheaper to maintain one of those than it is to go through and try to find a new platform or to build one in-house or to get something developed for you purposefully. Is it a security risk? Absolutely. But that's why we have things like distributed firewalls and NSXT, right? Like there are other ways to resolve some of these challenges. And it just comes down to what's the cost of rebuilding this thing versus continuing to keep it going.
Well, and it's interesting because people look at these costs of that, and I think this has been, I've heard oftentimes that, you end up with over half your budget going to support costs, and sometimes ridiculous support costs in these cases. And I talk to customers, they're like, well, why can't I run this for 9 years? And I'm like, well, you can if you're willing to shove a lot of money. But if you really want to buy something and deploy it and run it for 10 years and pay a kind of a more consistent and not have weird like discussions with your operating system vendor, you probably should have bought a mainframe. Those still exist. Like there are people who will happily take your money, and it's a normal thing to run a 10 plus year life cycle. But they're called a Z series. They're not small. You don't want one in your house. Trust me, you don't want one in your house. But that is something that hopefully is an industry we will move beyond. But as Glenn says, it sounds like there's a lot of that still going on.
Yeah, and it seems like Exchange was, I don't know if it was the first, but it was definitely that whole, Microsoft, I think, was probably the first that it was really like, hey, let us do this. They really took on that service model. And I think they led by example. Because like we talked about earlier, Exchange and all that stuff used to just always be traditionally in-house and in-house only. And now we look back, it's not even that long ago. And I can't even, like, why would you do this in-house? And so that service model really, it just makes a lot more sense. And I know VMware has definitely shifted in that direction as well. So Glenn, you work a lot with AWS, and I'd love to hear your take on how this change has affected customers.
Yeah, it's a good analogy, honestly, because the reality is there are still customers that run Exchange, right? There are customers for whom their email
reasons.
Yeah, either they've got regulators that demand it, and or email continues to be a sensitive enough subject where it is worthwhile for them to have it in house, right? Like, is it cheaper than just renting it from somebody else? No, not at all, right? But it depends on what you're trying to do with it, right? Like, it's entirely possible that by running it in-house, you get a capability that you just otherwise would not have, right? If you were using the SaaS version, because SaaS platforms typically, like, they normalize the peaks and provide something that works for the masses. And that means as a consumer of that service, you lose a little bit of customization, right? And in the VMware space, this is where, like, it's a huge gray area. This is why we have the multi-cloud strategy, why we have customer presence equipment as part of our managed service offers, because there are customers for whom they need to stay on premises. There are customers who are going to continue to run their private cloud infrastructures for the next 25 years, right? They're never going to move into a fully managed service. That's why there's things like VCF, right? To be able to service those edges and the varying degree of customer use cases that we have. It truly massive customers, right? Customers with 1,000+ nodes moving into something like VMware Cloud is a non-trivial endeavor, because typically what we discover with those really large accounts is there's a whole bunch of like process and baked in capabilities. And when you start to do the mapping to what we provide, you start to discover, like, oh, okay, well, you have this special report that you have to fill out because your government said you have to do this. And we need to give you the ability to generate that report. We've never ran into that before, so let's go do that. This is how AWS ended up with like 4,000 services, right? Like, you run a SaaS platform like that for 20 years, and you just slowly, through acquisition and in-house development, you discover all these unique flavors of ice cream that are required by all the different palates of the world. And you end up with a bunch of little commonalities that are just general platforms that service everybody, and then a bunch of one-offs that service very specific customer bases, and kind of like the support conversation. It just comes down to, look, how big of a check are you willing to write, and how many people want this thing. If you're the only one who wants it, you got to write a pretty big check. If there's a lot of people who want it, then you get it for free. There's just an endless variation in between those 2 points.
Well, and that is one thing that's interesting. You talk about it, Amazon, their PaaS offerings from a support basis. I think they've deprecated like one service in the entire history of AWS. I think it was like their original EC2 flavor that was like a VPS system or something pretty barbaric.
They're the anti-Google for sure.
We have like, there are some, I won't, name names, but you've already named them, who are notorious for just going around and murdering products. And then you've got, AWS, where I feel really bad for the PM for some of these things that, have probably 3 users left, but they're still trucking on.
Yeah.
But who knows? Maybe they've got some entire, they're also a software company that's over 20 years old. So they probably have some weird internal technical debt that, yes, they've built a newer, mousetrap, but they sure as hell haven't internally even migrated to it. So that's the fun of building these types of systems, is you internally use them. And VMware is not a young company by any means. And when you start poking around at internal, you're like, oh yeah, we need to move off this. Oh wait, we are actually our own largest customer on this ancient thing that we've forgotten about. So that's something that can happen.
Well, I like that you brought up VCF, or VMware Cloud Foundation, because even that in itself is sort of a version of software as a service, right? Like, or infrastructure as a service, because it's essentially, it's not in the public cloud, much like AWS, but I mean, it gives you that same service model, or that's the goal, right? Is to have that, instead of having to have everything and configure everything with, with all the complexities that we all know come with all the different parts that make up an infrastructure, something like VMware Cloud Foundation, I think that's kind of the goal of it, is to actually create sort of almost an on-premises service model, everything being done through one interface, and having that, that feature, the compatibility, you're not going to have to worry about it. You just enable it, you configure it, and, it's a little bit simpler than, piecemealing everything one by one.
Well, it's all about managing complexity, right? Like in the olden days, we used to talk about admin to server ratios. How many servers could an individual administrator manage? And there you'd have all the backroom finger pointing, similar to like console wars about, like a Linux admin can manage 20 servers and a Windows admin can only manage 4. But if you just look at the complexity of these stacks these days, right? Like, it is completely unrealistic to expect that you're going to manage the entire thing. I mean, unless you just want to spend absolutely no time doing the thing you're actually there to do.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
If I'm a paper company, I'm there to print paper, right? Manufacture paper. If I want to spend all of my time doing anything except that, then I can manage every single minutia, little part of the infrastructure, from the power all the way up through the network connections and all the services and automation platforms and everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or I can intelligently offload some of that, right? Let the utilities company worry about the electricity, and the network company worry about the ISP, worry about the network, and let a vendor like VMware worry about your baseline platform, and focus on the thing that actually matters to your business, right? Making paper. That's really what a lot of these services are about. And like, look at some of the recent CVEs, and like the Log4j outbreak. When that stuff happened, if you were a customer of VMware Cloud and AWS, you got an email that said, last night CVE XYZ was published and the following exploit was announced. Your environment has already been patched. You're safe, right? They did nothing, right? They just woke up and kept going. If you were running your infrastructure, you spent an entire week running around trying to figure out how to patch all of the various different platforms and operating systems and components, and are my network switches at risk? Like, it's a big thing. So it's just, where do you want to spend your time, right? And as an IT shop in particular, a technology company, which more and more businesses are becoming technology companies these days, like, where's the value? Is the value in managing the life cycle? Or is the value in owning the platform and investing in platforms that offload this work so that your teams have the cycles to do the things that they're there to actually do?
But Glenn, we're a tech company. We start with first principles, which means we must refactor everything from scratch. But, I jokingly
that's an
say
engineering
that,
team.
Yeah. I jokingly say that, but actually, VMware, I was shocked how much SaaS we used when I got here. I was like, wait, we own Zimbra. We actually owned an Exchange competitor at the time. And my mailbox was on 365. I'm like, well, I don't think we're going to own that for long. And then, I started looking around and I was like, I'm used to, working in small businesses, like you show up and it's like, okay, here's 4 things you have to have manual logins to because they're so ancient and poorly kept. This is an AIX box under a desk that doesn't speak LDAP properly for some reason. Like, I'm just used to all kinds of weird stuff. And I was like, Wait, I have one login, one workspace one. I log in, like everything's there, like, and half of this is SaaS. It's kind of wild.
I mean, look, in my own house, right? Like I've been in this industry for 20 years. I've been everything from a principal architect in a data center all the way up through, tech marketing and now product management. I spent over 10 years in the storage industry. I bought a Synology. I'm not running FreeNAS. I'm not running a file server.
Good point. Good point.
I have a little box on my shelf. It updates itself. I don't ever look at the dumb thing, right? It solves the problem for me. And as a result, I don't have to think about it. Plex just works. DNS is just there, right? Core services just function. It backs up to Backblaze. None of this is my problem, right?
Exactly.
I had a friend recently. They had a home NAS that actually ended up getting ransomwared, and I was like, "Wait, have you been updating it?" And he's like, "It was a QNAP. It was like 4 major releases behind." And apparently it was on the internet because of UPnP. So anyone who's out there, please stop. Go make sure your consumer router is not letting devices open firewall ports for themselves. But this got me thinking, as I go on this tangent here, we used to have to forward firewall ports to things in our house to access services or like do a video call and things. Like you actually used to have to do NAT transversal was the death of, making a VoIP or some type of peer-to-peer video call or something. And now everything just tunnels through the cloud. You no longer have to, like, I can't remember the last time I opened a port on a firewall leading into my house. And I have gear that obviously just doesn't religiously believe in UPnP because it's an abomination of security. But, this just used to be a thing of, you would open ports. Then we had routers that would automatically open ports, which is even stupider. And now just everything just works because
everything's
of
on
cloud services.
Yeah. But at the same time, right? Like you're giving something up there because the reason it just works is because it's going to a middle point over HTTPS, which is always open, and negotiating that connection somewhere else. Right. So to bring it back to the core infrastructure conversation, it really depends like what is the actual risk? What is the component? What is the value of that component to you and your business and the problem you're trying to solve? Maybe it is worth it for you to have to worry about opening ports because you don't want to have a proxy in the middle, right? Like our corporate firewall, like there are open ports on a corporate firewall to let our VPN clients come in. We're not proxying through a SaaS service for that because it's the core backbone communications of a major corporation with a lot of technology that the world depends upon. We have to take network security incredibly seriously, right? We have to own that. You're always going to own it. But, do we have to own like an internal message board? No. Right? Just pick your favorite open source flavor and or buy the SaaS platform that comes with your ticketing system and call it a day, right? Get on with the thing you're actually there to do.
No need to host a chat service. You already use Salesforce. Slack comes with it now, so
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So Glenn, you've been with AWS for a little while. I'm sure you were around for this whole Log4j, and you did mention that you work in product management now. So I'm curious, a little insight into how, situations like Log4j transition into, changes inside of the service. Any insight into how your time as a product manager has impacted the product itself?
Well, those are two different questions, right? So security is a funny part of this industry. It's a bunch of people who have each other's phone number, and when something starts to happen, like they're all having, Facebook chat. No, probably not Facebook chat.
This sounds like BGP, by the way. This sounds like how BGP works. It's a very small
kind of like they're. They got like signal message boards where they're talking to each other about, did you hear about this? It's going to be announced on the 15th. And, on the back end, there's a very small tiger team in every single major company that is working to figure out how to solve this problem. And then you get to the announce date, which is the drop dead point of, look, vendors, we told you about this. If you haven't fixed it yet, your customers are about to get lit on fire because we're going to disclose it. And the disclose is an important part because if you didn't disclose it, it would never get fixed. The vendors would just sit there and say, well, security through obscurity. Nobody knows about this. It's not really a risk, right?
Once it's disclosed, I'm going to score this a 2. This isn't a 10. It's just a 2,
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. Right. So security is a very, very different thing. And when it's something like Log4j, it comes out of nowhere, and you're kind of shocked at how many people have been working on it
Yeah,
and
right.
getting ready for that drop dead date. And even then, right, like when it's that widespread, when you're talking about, like I think the last time something like this happened is when there was an issue in OpenSSL. It touches everything, almost every part, every operating system, every application, all need to get updated, and it's a race for time. We had and again, this gets back to, where some of these past systems can make a difference, right? Like if you were a customer, even if you were on premises, right, you had stable security practices, nothing talked to the internet, all your management infrastructure was isolated, but that also means it's kind of hard to get to it. So maybe somebody decides one day that they're just going to drop a management VM and they're going to put it on that network, and somebody needs to get a file off SharePoint, so they just temporarily connect it to the internet just to download a patch real quick, and boom, there you go. Now you've got someone on the inside of your management network. 35 minutes later, you lose absolutely everything, right? Like, it is so easy to make one of those mistakes these days because these stacks are so complicated. It is just billions upon billions of lines of code that are maintained by hundreds of thousands of different people, and it all just kind of works, right? Until it starts to stop working.
Yeah.
And that's where, my life as a product manager these days, it's really about trying to take a look at that bigger picture, right? Of what are customers struggling with? What's consuming time that shouldn't be consuming time? And then how do we figure out a way to make that easier for them? Right. A couple of the big major features that we've released recently inside VMC and AWS, they're all about that. Right. We've been working for 18 months to slowly get the entire fleet upgraded to the new version of vSAN object reservation and Slack space management, so that
nice.
We had the new object model and the ability to do host reservations, and thus we were able to make a service definition change and reduce our Slack space requirement. We previously needed 30% free space capacity in case of a resynchronization. We've now reduced that to 20%. That returned 5 petabytes of usable capacity to the VMware Cloud customer fleet. Right?
That's incredible.
Like it in a lot of cases, it was customers being able to take whole hosts out of their infrastructure because they don't need it anymore. Right? We've also been doing a lot of work around smaller instances, right? Our 2-node stretch clusters, 2-node host clusters. We've recently introduced the ability to scale down to a 2-node cluster. So if you previously had bought like a 4-host at the early days of VMC, you could scale down to 3, scale down to 2, right? And why does this matter? Well, the downside with a SaaS service is typically, they're a little bit expensive, right? Now, it's cheaper than you doing it yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
But you have to add up, the personnel costs, the licensing costs, the opportunity cost, right? The fact that you're not doing something else, the power, the space, the cooling, the infrastructure. It's only once you add all that stuff up that you can really get a dollars to donuts and see that, if I were doing this, it would cost me $1,000.
Yeah.
But I can pay the vendor $600 and they'll do it for me, right? I save $400 in the transaction. But at first, you just look at it and go, wait a minute, I can buy the software for $250 and you're charging me $600? How does this work?
Right? Yeah, that's like saying I can buy a gallon of paint from the paint store for like $40 and I can paint my own house, or you could actually pay a professional to do it. A big difference.
Yeah, are you factoring in the 60 hours of labor and all the fact that you're going to have to go back and
the refactor.
Yeah, you're going to get it wrong. Like I do a lot of home improvement. I always I end up buying like 6 or 7 extra boards because I know I'm going to cut them wrong once or twice. I'm not a professional framer, right? Like it's the cost of doing it yourself versus just hiring someone who can get it right the first time. And that's really where product management is really focused, particularly in a SaaS model. When you're building software services for customers, you spend a lot of time just talking to them about their pain points and trying to figure out how you can make it easier for them and give them back time. That's really what this is about, right? When you buy a service, you're buying an outcome, and as a result, you get back time. the only commodity that cannot be generated. And that's why we're seeing the world move to a SaaS-based model, because for the most part, most businesses recognize that their time is the most valuable commodity they have, and selectively offloading as much as possible just lets them focus on the part that they're there to do.
Well said, man. Well said. I think that wraps it up. We started talking about the fact that, that a lot of these older server versions are moving to end of life, and it's just a common cycle. But it's a cycle that doesn't really need to happen with a service like AWS and other services. And I think that the real takeaway for me, you can look at a price of something and then, but if you're going to really have a fair comparison of that price, you really have to factor in all the pieces, right? The maintenance, the security, the wisdom,
SREs,
everything, security, all of those have to factor in when you're considering which one is more economical, right?
Yeah, that's the old saying, right? Free like a puppy.
Free like a puppy. Yeah, that's exactly true. I like that. All right, Glenn, we're coming up on the top of the hour. I want to thank you, as always, for joining us on Virtually Speaking. Open door invitation, and enjoy the rest of your week, my friend.
Yeah, always great to talk to you guys. Take care.
All right. John, that music tells me it's time to go. So if you want to get more of Virtually Speaking, you can go to thespeakingpodcast.com. You can catch this in all episodes there, and you can also subscribe to us on Twitter and Instagram. We're at VirtSpeaking. A big thanks to my good friend, Mr. Glenn Sizemore, for joining us this week. We're back next week, but until then, bye for now. Thanks, Glenn, man. Always a blast having you on, my friend.
I was looking for my Cat 8 Terminators to show you how big they're like 2 inches. It's ridiculous.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like this 2-inch chunk of metal. It's insane, but supposedly I never have to replace these cables. I'm good for 40 gigs, and this is probably like Bill Gates saying you never need more than 4K of memory, but hopefully I never need more than 40 gigs of home networking. What kind of dystopian future are we in if that becomes true?
Oh, yeah.
Enough of this jibber jabber.